Hello, hello.
Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He is the author of the book Measuring Inclusion, no other than Mr. Paolo Gaudiano.
Excellent. Thank you.
Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Paolo, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
Thank you, Daniel. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, my name is Paolo Gaudiano, and I've been working in diversity, equity, and inclusion for about 10 years now. And I came into it from a somewhat unusual angle. For one thing, for those that work in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the United States, it is not very common for a white man who is cisgender, heterosexual, with no disabilities like myself to work in DEI. But also, it's the unique way that I came into this space, which had to do with an analytical approach that I had been developing and using for multiple decades by the time I started to do this work. And it's a approach that actually quantifies the link between an individual within a collective, whether it's an organization or a city or an industry or an entire society, and how you connect that individual to the behavior of the system. So, in particular, 10 years ago, I saw an opportunity to link how companies treat their employees to the financial outcomes of the company itself. And I embarked on a journey to do the work and then published this book that you're showing right now on measuring inclusion, which really summarizes the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years and provides some guidance on how to do diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that does not cause backlash and that actually links to how much money companies can make.
Mr. Paolo Gaudiano, thank you so much for sharing your book to the world. So, how does inclusion mean in a business or organizational context?
A lot of people are confused about the term inclusion because while diversity, pretty much everybody understands what it means, inclusion very often is used to describe the feelings of individuals, and other times it's used to describe the culture. And I try to be very careful because those are two very, very different things. To me, what inclusion boils down to, I have a very simple definition. I say inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get, equity is what you want. What do I mean? Well, inclusion is what you do. By that, I mean that if you're an organization and people in your organization are having different kinds of experiences just because of their identity that has nothing to do with their ability to do the work, then you're not being very inclusive. And the reason why I say that diversity is what you get is because diversity is a symptom. It's the result of everything that happens in the organization. And trying to fix diversity by hiring people from more diverse backgrounds is really a misguided effort. It's a bit like walking in your house in the winter, feeling cold, looking at the thermostat. It reads, 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And how do you fix that? You light a match under the thermostat. And well, that's not going to fix anything. You're still going to have drafty windows and an open door, and you might burn the house down. Instead, we need to understand that by the way that you treat your people and the different experiences mean that some people are more likely to leave your organization because they're going to be less satisfied. And that means that you will have fewer of them. And in fact, in every company where diversity is low, you also find that the retention rates of people from underrepresented groups is always lower than it is for men, for white men who are typically the majority, at least in the United States. And so that's why I say inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get. In the book, I talk about a computer simulation that I developed that actually shows that quantitatively. And then the last thing is, why do I say equity is what you want? It's because ultimately, if some people in your organization are less satisfied, they're going to produce less, which means that you're making fewer revenues, you're making a smaller amount of money, and they're going to be more likely to leave, which means that you're going to have to pay to hire new people. And those are costs that a lot of companies are incurring right now invisibly. And so, what I recommend people is to think about how they can measure inclusion so that they can figure out where they're losing money and actually understand why they're losing money and use that information to create companies that are more welcoming and make more money.
So, Mr. Paolo, how does inclusion contribute to higher profits and business success?
Well, we have developed a small calculator. It's on our website, alaria.tech, TECH, and we talk about it in the book. I talk about it in the book a little bit. And the calculator takes into account the size of a company, it takes into account the demographic breakdown of the company and the satisfaction levels or inclusion levels, which are very similar in the sense that being less included leads to less satisfaction. And our data shows that those are very closely linked. And then it takes some assumptions about how much individual contributors or individual employees are contributing to the revenues. And then it also calculates how much it costs to replace people that leave. And then if we know the levels of inclusion or satisfaction of different groups, then we can estimate how many people you're losing every year because of the lower level of inclusion and how much money you're losing because of the lower productivity and lower revenues. So for example, if you have, let's say, 1,000 women in your company and 1,000 men, and let's say the satisfaction of the 1,000 men is really high, like 90%, the satisfaction of the women is 80%. That translates into those women producing less money. And so if you're making an average of, let's say, $200,000 per employee per year, well, you may be losing 10 to 15 to $20,000 a year per employee that is dissatisfied. That could be millions of dollars because of all the women that are less satisfied. And if a percentage of those are leaving that would not normally leave, that costs you even more money. And our calculator, we've used a lot of both our own research as well as research that is available in the general public, in the public domain, to estimate that a typical company is losing invisibly around 20% of their net profits, which means that it's a pretty big chunk of money. And that's how inclusion is linked to the success of a business. It's because if you have low levels of inclusion for some groups, it is literally costing you money without realizing it. And if you can identify where you're losing that money, where you have that low inclusion, and you can fix it, you can make more money.
Certainly. More money, money, people. So, what is the connection between employee happiness and workplace inclusion?
Well, what we realized a while back is that people, when they ask about inclusion, they often ask people, do you feel included? And I think that that's actually kind of a misguided question to ask. And I like to use an analogy between inclusion and health. What do I mean by that? Well, when you introduced me tonight, you didn't say, this is Paolo Gaudiano. He's very healthy. But if I'd been coughing or if I'd had, a sore throat or something, we might have said something about it. So the point being that we tend to notice when we're sick more than when we're healthy. Inclusion works in a very similar way. We're much more likely to notice when we're excluded than we were included. So now, if you take that analogy a bit farther and you think about when you go see a doctor, imagine if you went to a doctor and you weren't feeling well, and the doctor simply asked you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how healthy do you feel? Oh, 7, take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. Or even better, a lot of companies, they ask you exactly that. They say, how included do you feel? Well, that's kind of useless, right? Or they might ask you things like, do you feel that our company has an inclusive culture? That would be like going to a doctor and having the doctor ask you, do you feel that our hospital is good to its patients? And then trying to heal you based on that information. So, really, to me, what is crucial is that to understand what is actually the inclusion of a company, you need to understand what are the experiences that impact people's satisfaction, people's happiness within the organization. And so the way that we measure inclusion is that we have an online platform. We do workshops where we introduce these ideas. Then we invite people to go to this platform and completely anonymously and untraceably, we ask them to share stories of things that have interfered with their ability to do their work. And it doesn't necessarily have to make them feel excluded. It could be, I sent my laptop for repairs in the IT department and it took them 3 weeks to do it. That doesn't seem like exclusion, but if you collect the data and you find that that happens to women twice as much as it happens to men, then it means that the company is not being all that inclusive. And so we measure inclusion, and what we find is that the way that we define inclusion, or rather the way that we define exclusion, it's events that happen that have to do with your work-life balance, with your access and participation, with your compensation and benefits, with your ability to use your skills, with how you're being respected. We have what we call these experience categories. Those are things that are directly linked to the satisfaction and happiness of employees. And that's how we measure inclusion. So essentially, when we see that a company is not being very inclusive, we see exactly what is happening to people that is causing them to be less happy and therefore less productive and therefore more likely to leave. And therefore, the money is going out the window for companies that are having these problems.
So, Mr. Paulo, how can organizations measure inclusion beyond surface level diversity?
So, what I recommend to companies, and I want to be very clear about something, measuring diversity is important, but it should be used the way that a company uses its balance sheet. If you think about how we manage our financial assets, right? We have the balance sheet that tells you overall what is the blend of assets, equities, liabilities in the organization, but it doesn't tell us how we got there. It's a snapshot in time. Diversity is the same thing. To me, inclusion is a bit like cash flow. You're measuring the pluses and minuses that are increasing and decreasing the value of your human assets. And so, what I recommend to companies is to really start thinking about both and using one, measuring inclusion, by literally finding out what are the specific things, the specific experiences that people have in the workplace. Because once you understand them, you will understand where there are problems that you may need to fix, and you will understand how that impacts your diversity. So, for instance, we find very often that people complain about not being invited to meetings in which decisions are made that impact them. Well, if you find that that happens a lot, let's say that it happens to 100 people in an organization of 1,000 people. Well, if of those 100 people, 70 of them happen to be women, 30 of them happen to be men, you can create a policy that says managers have to keep a spreadsheet and a list of everybody that needs to be invited to our meetings. And we're going to make sure that you're doing that. We're going to actually audit you on a monthly basis or quarterly basis. And if you improve that policy, it will be good for everybody. It will be good for the 70 women and for the 30 men. And so that's what we recommend to people is just like the way that you measure finances, you ask people to submit expense reports, and then those expense reports get rolled up. And at the top level, you get information about your P&L and L and your balance sheet. And we recommend doing something very similar with inclusion, which is you measure it at the level of individuals, and then you roll it up and you use diversity to tell you, am I going in the right direction? Where are there problems? And then the measuring inclusion tells you what exactly those problems are, who is the most impacted. And because you see the stories, the narratives, you understand exactly what you need to do to fix the problems.
So, what are the common misconceptions about inclusion in the workplace?
I would say the biggest misconception is that it's really less of a misconception and more about a confusion. I would argue that if you ask 10 people, anyone, DEI experts or HR experts or CEOs, and you ask them what inclusion means, you will get 10 different definitions. And that I think is a profound problem in the space because people talk about the feelings of inclusion, the culture of inclusion. And even if they do that, it's very vague. Well, do you feel included because somebody explicitly excluded you from an activity, or do you feel excluded because maybe you feel that because of your skin color or your gender, you're being treated differently than you would otherwise be? And those are very, very difficult things to answer. What is much easier to do is to just kind of measure what are the things that are actually happening to you in the organization. And when you do that, it can really clarify. So part of what I like about the work that I'm doing and part of what goes in the book is about saying, look, there are a lot of definitions of inclusion, a lot of definitions of equity. I am suggesting some definitions. It's not about being right or being wrong. It's just that these definitions that I offer are very tangible, they're very measurable, and they can be linked very clearly to the financial success of an organization. And that's really what has been missing. It's like, oh, leaders need to become more inclusive and that'll make their companies better and they will somehow, become more diverse and magically make more money. I think that that's been a really big misconception, is that just somehow having diversity in the company will somehow make the company more inclusive, more successful, and make more money, instead of focusing on inclusion, which to me is the root of what is actually happening within the organization that leads to all the other factors like diversity and finance.
Very well articulated, Mr. Paolo. Very well said. And what are some key metrics used to measure inclusion in a company?
The way that we measure inclusion is, as I mentioned, we invite people to go on a website, and the first thing that they see, and again, we don't ask for email, we don't ask for their name, so it's completely anonymous. We ask them to share a little bit of demographic data and job related data. And that demographic data depends on where in the world we're doing it, because in some countries you cannot ask certain questions, and we've done this on the global scale. And the work related data are things like how senior of a level, and do you work remotely or hybrid or in the office? And also we ask about your level of satisfaction, because we always want to prove that what we measure as inclusion is very closely related to satisfaction. And then what we do is we ask people to share one or more or as many experiences as they want, and each one, think of that as like a little sticky note. You literally write something that happened to you. For example, you might say, I was supposed to get promoted 3 months ago, but my promotion keeps getting delayed. And then we ask you to use, we have these 8 categories that are defined in the platform. And again, there are things like compensation and benefit, career and growth, or respect or recognition for your work. And so you choose 1 or 2 categories. And then we also have what we call sources. And the sources are things like, is it a company policy? Is it your leadership, your management, your peers? So, for example, in the example that I gave a moment ago of saying I was supposed to get promoted 3 months ago or 6 months ago and I still have not been promoted, you might classify that as it's an issue of career and growth. And you might say that the source is your manager. When we collect that data from a lot of people, we now have a combination of some identity data, but more importantly, we have quantitative data about which categories are the ones where we see the biggest number of issues and which sources are the ones that are causing the most issues. So the first thing that we do, we might tell a company, look, we calculate what we call the exclusion score, which is effectively a way of measuring how pervasive a certain problem is and how severe, how acute it is. And so we use these metrics to come up with a number that we call the exclusion score. And then we tell the company, okay, first of all, top line, your company has a big problem with career advancement. A lot of people complain about that. And then we find out that, oh, by the way, in terms of who is responsible for that, it has to do mostly with management, with direct managers. And then when we look at the identity traits, which we don't even really have to do, but most companies want to know that. But we could say, okay, this impacts women at this level, it impacts men at this level, it impacts people of color at one level, it impacts white people at a different level. And once you combine the data, it tells you where to look. And when you then look at the actual experiences that are linked to those clusters, then you can see exactly what is happening. For instance, you may find that a lot of people complain about their performance reviews being delayed. And then you might say, okay, well, we need to create a better process to make sure that performance reviews are actually done on a regular basis and that we're checking to make sure that everybody's getting performance reviews and not only the favorites of the manager, which often is one of the ways that biases creep in.
So, Mr. Paolo, what would be your advice for those company out there want to try inclusion?
Honestly, I think, I mean, of course, I would love it if everybody bought my book and read about it because I think, and we have very clear. So we have a couple of chapters in the introduction, a couple of chapters that talk about the methodology. Then I show very detailed data that we have collected across a number of projects, and then we also share some of the experiences that people have, given us permission to share in the book. Then we talk about case studies, and then I have 2 chapters that are specifically about companies that want to do this entirely on their own. And one chapter tells you about step by step what you would do to measure inclusion, and then the other chapter tells you about some of the tips and tricks that we have learned over the years by doing this, and some of the things to look out for, some best practices to ensure that you're collecting a lot of data, that you're collecting good data, and more importantly, that you know what to do with the data and that you're actually maximizing the benefit for your company. So my recommendation would be for companies, especially as you know right now in the United States, the word, the acronym DEI has become a very negative acronym. And right now it's crucial that we learn to look at aspects of DEI that are not controversial, because when you focus on diversity, there is a complaint. People say, well, if you're going to increase the percentage of women, it means you have to decrease the percentage of men. If you're going to increase the number of people with disabilities, it means that you have to decrease the number of people without disabilities. That kind of zero-sum game mindset is what's causing a lot of the backlash. But when you focus on inclusion, you're not bucketing people, you're bucketing experiences. You focus on things like respect and compensation and benefits. And nobody's going to complain if you say, oh, look, we have a problem with respect in our company. We have a problem with the way that we do performance reviews. We have a problem with the way that our meetings are organized. Let's fix that. And it's truly going to benefit everyone, but particularly the ones that have been the most impacted by these problems. And that completely avoids the backlash. So that's why I think right now, especially, it's so important for people to move beyond just measuring diversity and learning how to measure inclusion so that they can actually make forward progress without creating some of the polarization and the problems that we're seeing right now.
So, what would be your short term and long term goals in writing, Mr. Paolo?
I wrote the book, I started writing it when it was already pretty clear, both just from talking to people and from the data we were collecting, that we were starting to see a lot of backlash. We were starting to see a growing number of employees who identified as white men cisgender, heterosexual, who were complaining about DEI. And interestingly, we also started to see a lot of people who were not members of the majority complain about DEI too, because they felt that they were being tokenized, they were being called DEI hires, or they were seeing companies doing things that were not very smart, like, hey, let's hire the first black person that we find or the first woman that we find just so that we can fill our targets. And so people started to complain about that very heavily already in late 2022. And so in 2023, I decided to write the book in part because I wanted to make sure that this work got out into the public so that people could see how to face the backlash and how to approach the work in a way that would avoid the backlash. And that was really my number one goal. I mean, of course, as a founder of a startup called Aleria, we also love, when people read the book, we're getting a lot of interest, a lot of companies that are reaching out right now asking us for help measuring inclusion in their organization, which of course I love to do both because it's good for my company and because I believe it's good for their companies and for society as a whole.
So, how can organizations address resistance from employees or leadership regarding inclusion efforts?
One of the big things that we do when we have this thing that we call the journey to inclusion, and it has 4 stages. The first one is what we call discover inclusion. In discover inclusion, we work typically with the DI team and then with the leadership, and we use our calculator to show a company how much money they're likely losing because of poor inclusion, and then we give them the presentation that explains all the ideas and many more, and the ideas that we talked about right now. When we if with the next stage is what we call assess your state of inclusion, and that's where we actually work with employees and we do a workshop, and a workshop is very much about education. So there is a really strong component that has to do with showing people that there are ways to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion that do not threaten them, that do not make them feel guilty, that do not make them feel like they're bad people and they need to fix their biases. We completely avoid all of that, and we show people that there's actually a reason why everybody truly benefits from organizations that are more inclusive. This is not just saying, oh, it wouldn't be fair, wouldn't it be wonderful if everybody was treated the same. We're quite literally saying, here is a way that you can do that. Here's how it does not at all cause backlash. And here is exactly how you can do it step by step. And when you do that, it really helps to minimize the backlash. And for what it's worth, I've given presentations to dozens and dozens of companies. I've gone into a university recently and spoke to students in a graduate course that was literally kind of an anti-DEI course, if you will, or that was a very strong theme. And by the end of the lecture, they loved it. They thought this is great, and more people should hear about it because it completely gets rid of that really what a lot of people reasonably say is an unfair approach that unfortunately has become somewhat popular, especially in recent years in DI, where again it's about unconscious bias training, and it's about setting targets, and it's about measuring pay gaps, and it's all about you're doing bad things, stop doing bad things. And people don't like that. People don't like being told you're a bad person, regardless of whether they're truly bad or whether, in my opinion, I think that there's also a lot of misunderstanding on the part of DI experts. I think that I see a lot of my very dear colleagues who make assumptions about white people wanted to hang on to the power, white people wanted to oppress black people. Yes, there are some, but they're very few. The problem is that those very few are very good at manipulating the messaging. And so what I try to do is I try to come at them with a different kind of messaging that counters that very negative rhetoric, and also that creates an economic motivation, which is what companies need in order to do the work. So it's a combination of the education of the individual employees, education of the leadership, and then the collecting the data sort of takes you to that next level.
So, Mr. Paulo, how can do companies balance the need for inclusion with maintaining a strong business focus?
I would argue that this is another area that I think has been completely misunderstood. Uh, a lot of people who are not CEOs and chief HR officers and CFOs don't realize that people in an organization are the most valuable asset, but most importantly, they're the most expensive budget item. So, what I do not understand is how leaders who use platforms or tools to optimize their portfolios of assets, whether it's financial assets, marketing assets, product assets, inventory assets, we have tools that help us to figure out how diversifying those assets yields better results. When it comes to our people, there are no tools that do that. And unfortunately, employees for a company only appear as liabilities on the balance sheet. They're only appear as a cost. This is a major problem because I think that every company, if they learn how to optimize their personnel through diversification as being one of the tools, imagine if you could take your single most expensive budget item and increase its efficiency by 5%. So I challenge anyone out there that runs a company today. How much money would that make your organization if you simply took your existing organization and you improved its efficiency by 5% by being more inclusive, which ensures that you have a more diversified workforce? That would be an enormous amount of money. So the idea that people have to balance DEI or inclusion with business practices is completely backwards. It's completely backwards. It's exactly the other way around. It's like people who are not understanding how to do this. Well, right now, unfortunately, very few people understand it. But once companies start to figure this out, they will demolish the competition. Because if they can get more efficiency out of their most valuable asset and most expensive budget item, they will get an unfair competitive advantage and will absolutely demolish the competition. So my hope is that part of my work is to make them understand that and make them motivated economically to recognize that inclusion has to be a key part of their strategy and not a nice to have just to make people happy.
Yes, definitely. So, to wrap up our discussion for tonight, Mr. Paolo, what are some success stories of businesses that have effectively measured and improved inclusion?
Well, we have in the book, I have one chapter on case studies and I include 5 different organizations. They range from a startup that was only about 50 people when we first worked with them, all the way to a global pharmaceutical company, AstraZeneca. And I talk about what we did for all of these organizations. And interestingly, we find that in the smaller organizations, it's just because they're more nimble, it was a lot faster. They were able to go through multiple cycles of measuring inclusion, identifying a problem, fixing the problem, then measuring again, identifying the next problem, etc. The larger organizations move more slowly, but I can tell you that we have a number of clients that are repeat clients that came to us, measured inclusion, found some problems, fixed those problems, and then decided that they wanted to come back and work with us again to measure inclusion further. We're now starting to do something that we should have done before. I wish we'd thought about it before, but now that we have the calculator, one of the things that we realize is how crucial it is to link to finance. And so we are starting to work with organizations where at the outset of a project, we track a number of metrics, financial metrics, but also performance metrics that have to do with personnel, such as retention rates, promotion rates, and things of that sort. And then our goal is to start actually collecting data over the years to say, okay, you did this. We knew that this problem cost you X dollars, and now we're going to measure it again a year later, and we're going to see how your metrics have changed. We're going to see how much money you actually saved. So for the time being, the evidence is more companies that are very happy with the work, that they see a measurable and tangible change in people's attitudes. And now we're working on actually collecting enough data over time to be able to put metrics to it and say, here's how much money companies have saved over the last 5 years or 2 years or 3 years by measuring inclusion and taking care of problems that way.
Mr. Paolo Gaudiano, thank you so much for sharing your book to the world. And we are looking forward for more empowering books like this. So can you please invite our listeners to support your book?
Thank you, Daniel, Mr. Lucas. It's been a real pleasure, and I do hope that listeners will enjoy my book. You can find it in any of the online sellers, and you can find my website at alaria.tech. And I look forward to any questions. Anybody that wants to reach out on LinkedIn, I'd be more than happy to connect.
Yes, people, support Mr. Paolo Gaudiano because if you support him, more empowering books like this to come. So, Mr. Paolo, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
More to come, people. See you soon.